This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. I used Squarespace to build both Basics with Babish and BingingWithBabish.com. On the sites, you'll find recipes, equipment lists, other news, and updates. All beautifully designed, if I do say so myself. Get 10% off your first Squarespace order by visiting squarespace.com/babish.
You're totally freaked out and without even thinking about it.
How do you lose your map at a time like that?
Believe me, I've asked myself the same thing ever since.
Hello there, welcome back to another episode of Anime with Alvin. Today we're going to be taking a look at the ramen from RWBY, which in the show is served in a giant large pot. And I have to say, making a ton of ramen from scratch was an exciting idea. And we're going to be using the Way of Ramen's video as a reference for Shoyu Ramen. In his video, he references Keizo Shimamoto, a highly respected ramen chef and actually someone I know very personally. So, thank you to you guys for the direction. We're first starting with the soup. I'm going to take an entire whole chicken and put it in a pot and cover it with water and just let it cook for a little bit. While that comes to a boil, I'm going to get started on the chashu. I'm taking this rather large slab of pork belly without skin and just trimming off any flaps or bumps of meat that might get in the way while rolling. These scraps will be saved for a snack later, so make sure that you don't waste those. This pork belly gets rolled up nice and tight with some butcher's twine and dropped into a pot into which we're going to dump some marinade. That means 1 cup of soy sauce, 1 cup of sake, 2 cups of water, and 3 inches of ginger, 3 cloves of garlic, and 2 scallions just chopped up. While waiting this to come to a simmer, I realized that the liquid isn't high enough to cover the pork, so I doubled the amount of soy sauce and sake while adding in a 1/3 cup of granulated sugar to balance the sweetness. This goes for about 2 hours, flipping every maybe 15 or 20 minutes or so to make sure that all sides of the pork are evenly coated. Now that our whole chicken is simmering, I'm adding in 2.5 pounds of chicken feet and roughly the skins of 8 chicken thighs. These will add some really nice flavor and collagen to help thicken the soup. This is going to go on a low-medium heat for at least 6 hours and maybe up to 12. Remember those pork trimmings we cut off earlier? Well, now it's time to make them into a snack. So I'm just throwing them into a little pan, letting them brown and sear until the fat starts to give the outsides a little nice golden brown color, and adding in a handful of sugar just to help get a caramel started. Once the color is looking good and the sugar is just on the verge of burning, I'm adding in 1/2 cup of soy sauce and 1/2 cup of sake to help deglaze the pan and just give everything a nice little bath. To balance the flavors, I'm finally adding a 1/4 cup of sugar just to help glaze the meat. It's a pretty foolproof sauce that works for any sort of meat that you have left over. I just like it because it's a way to use up leftover scraps. We ate all of this in about 15 seconds. Another component you might find in some pretty tasty bowls of ramen is an aroma oil. And in this case, I'm taking the green-white parts of 3 scallions, chopping them up pretty thinly, dicing up 2 shallots in pretty small chunks, doing the same exact thing with another 3-inch knob of ginger, and crushing and chopping up 4 garlic cloves into small pieces. Once our little army of aromatics have been assembled and divided, they go into 125 milliliters of vegetable oil, starting the heat from very low and just turning this up until medium to low heat, just until the moisture has evaporated and every single little bit in there has turned a nice brown. Once this smells really good and aromatic, this gets strained into a bowl which we're going to keep the oil separated but also keep those crispy bits for later. This is a little flavor jar that contains 300 milliliters of shoyu and 32.5 milliliters of mirin. It's been sitting for a week because that will allow the flavors to develop in order to make our tare, a very concentrated, powerful, flavorful sauce that essentially seasons our soup. I'm not sure exactly what goes on, but I can tell you over the course of the week, the flavors and aromas have changed quite immensely. And to keep jamming this thing with more flavor, I'm going to add in a sheet of kombu and about 2 shiitake mushrooms dried into this and let this sit overnight. Now, to make some dashi, combining 2.5 liters of water with 25 grams of kombu and 12.5 grams of dried shiitake mushrooms. This also hydrates and sits overnight. While that's going, I'm going to soft boil some eggs really quick. Pretty simple. 8 to 12 eggs, as many as you'd like, 6.5 minutes in boiling water, and straight into an ice bath. Foolproof method for me gives me a nice soft jammy yolk every single time. When the next day comes around, we're going to pour all of this into a pot, bring this up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit with a temperature gun, which I'm going to use on everybody in this room to see if it works. Aha! Everybody's vitals is looking good. And once this reaches 140 degrees, I'm removing the kombu and shiitake and then bringing this up to 194 degrees. Then I'm adding in 32.5 grams of katsuobushi, letting that steep for about 5 minutes or so and straining the whole thing so we have a nice container of dashi. To finish off our tare, I'm heating up the shoyu mixture until it reaches 175 degrees, removing the kombu and shiitake mushrooms and turning off the heat. Then in goes 5 grams of sea salt and 10 milliliters of Thai fish sauce just to add some extra punch of flavor. Like I said, that this thing is very strong, and I'm quite excited to see how this will eventually flavor our soup. And this is our chicken soup from the day before. It's been going for about 12 hours and it has rested overnight to cool. I'm just removing a lot of the fat from the surface and saving some of that for later, but also taking off a lot of the scum and extra fat that we do not need in the end product. To strain this, I'm not trying to disturb the whole soup by dumping the whole thing in a strainer, rather ladling it cup by cup into a strainer, as much liquid as possible without getting those chicken bits stuck in the middle. After removing all of those little feet and entire carcass of chicken, I'm pouring the rest and trying to get as clear of a chicken soup into this as we can. These eggs have been hanging out in that ice bath for long enough, so it's time to get them out of their shells and into somewhere safer to be cut open at a later date. I always like peeling eggs in water because it helps me remove any little bits of shell or skin that might be stuck to the surface. This soup now goes into a pot and begins to heat before we can add in its aromatics. So while that's going, here is our chashu, which has now emerged from its very flavorful soy bath from yesterday. I like to let it sit in the marinade overnight that it's braised in, just to absorb a little bit more flavor. My favorite part about cutting cold chashu is that it stays perfectly together and you get those nice pink cross sections and swirls that reminds you that you are doing something good with your life. These are gonna go set aside because we're gonna go and give them some solid heat treatment at a later time. The aromatics for our chicken soup is vegetables. So I'm throwing in a quarter of a head of Napa cabbage cut into squares, half a head of garlic which is just cut in half, and about 25 grams of ginger which is peeled and been sliced. This cooks for about 15 minutes at 200 degrees Fahrenheit and the whole thing gets strained once more. Again, you can eat those vegetables too. I definitely took those home and added it to my chicken. And just like that, our soup is ready. And now for the really fun part. It is time to assemble our battle station to plate up. So I'm taking each and every single one of these eggs, cutting them in half and taking a half a second to admire their beautiful, runny, soft yolk. Next up is our chashu, which we have spread into a single layer on a baking sheet just so that we can take a blowtorch and beautifully sear each side of them. This is usually my favorite part of eating a bowl of ramen if they have it, and I like to get a little smoky and torched just because it smells really good. Now that our army of toppings have been assembled, including those greens from those scallions we cut earlier, we can now start to build this entire giant bowl of ramen. I have to my left a giant pot of boiling water, to which I'm going to ladle a little bit inside the bowl just to heat it up. These are some beautifully freshly handmade ramen noodles we got from a Japanese grocery store. I could definitely make my own, but they'd probably be really not good. So these are gonna do just fine. They go into the water for roughly 1 minute per batch, and while those are cooking, I'm going to build my soup. I remember watching Keizo make a bowl of ramen a long time ago, and usually he starts by putting in the tare first. So after exiting the hot water used to heat the bowl, I'm pouring in the tare first, followed by a lot of the chicken soup that we have made. And once those noodles are ready, batch by batch, I'm going to dump them into their nice little broth bath and try to fold them using chopsticks and provide a nice little flotation device onto which our toppings will sit on top of. And now we have to plate this according to how it looks in the show. So we're going to start by doing a multitude of eggs in one quadrant of our bowl, followed by a handful of pan-seared enoki mushrooms that we just quickly cooked off camera. Next to it goes a handful of our crunchy aromatic bits from our oil earlier. Those fried garlicky shallot, ginger, scallion bits are going to be pretty good. Opposite the eggs goes our entire army of chashu slices, torched and seared. At this point, I'm getting quite excited because usually I only get 2 to 3 pieces of pork in my ramen bowl, and now we have about 7,000. And finally, to close the gap, a handful of the scallion green. After doing a little bit more nudging and fidgeting, I now present to you our giant bowl of shoyu ramen from RWBY, with everything pretty much made from scratch besides the noodles themselves. A recipe inspired by the Way of Ramen's video and my dear friend Keizo Shimamoto. Thank you to you both for providing such valuable assistance with this. And we've been working on this pretty hard for 2 days, so I think it's about time we ate this thing. And as always, first you must taste the soup. Wow. This, I am surprised, but I'm also not surprised, considering this is a recipe that comes from 2 of the most respected ramen people on the internet. It is amazing, so full of flavor, but not heavy or rich like a lot of ramen can be. If I really wanted to describe this, I could go to thesaurus.com and start pulling out some big words, but I gotta tell you, this just tastes super satisfying. All the toppings, the eggs, the pork, everything just goes together so well, which means that the whole entire studio definitely went a little ham on this one. Steve took home the rest.
Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring today's episode. They've been a great partner in supporting the Babish culinary universe and bringing my websites to life. From websites to online stores to domains and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for you to build your online presence. They also have SEO tools so that your site is getting found and searched by more people more often. If you want to try it for yourself, you can start your free trial today by visiting squarespace.com/babish to get 10% off your first purchase.